In the 1960s, America was dying from heart disease, and nobody knew why. The nation was gripped by fear, doctors were confused. Scientists were searching desperately for answers. Two suspects emerged from the chaos of conflicting evidence: fat and sugar, both lurking in every modern meal, both growing more common as America grew wealthier and food companies grew more powerful. The debate seemed simple at first, but it would become one of the most important financial conspiracies in modern history, affecting the lives of billions of people and costing the world hundreds of billions of dollars in healthcare expenses and human suffering that continues to this very day. The sugar industry understood something that would change everything. They knew that if scientists proved sugar caused heart disease, their entire industry could collapse overnight. The financial stakes were absolutely enormous, and the sugar companies refused to accept that possibility without a fight. But they were smart about how they fought back. Rather than arguing publicly with scientists or trying to discredit research they didn't like, the sugar industry chose a quieter strategy that would prove far more effective. They decided to influence the science itself. They would do this by finding respected researchers at prestigious universities and offering them money to write scientific reviews that would shift blame away from sugar and toward fat. This strategy was brilliant, and it was absolutely ruthless. The sugar industry's plan was simple but devastating. Internal letters that would later be discovered revealed exactly what they were trying to accomplish. They would fund respected researchers. They would control the narrative around what the science supposedly showed. They would protect the sugar industry's interests. And they needed the right institution to make it work. They needed somewhere so prestigious, so trusted, that when their funded research came out, nobody would question it. They needed Harvard University. Harvard was the perfect target. Harvard's reputation was beyond reproach. If Harvard published research, people believed it. Doctors read it and trusted it completely. Policymakers based their decisions on it. The government listened to Harvard scientists. So in the mid-1960s, the Sugar Research Foundation approached Harvard University with an offer. They would pay respected Harvard nutrition researchers thousands of dollars in today's money, roughly $50,000 per researcher, to write a scientific review. This was serious money in the academic world of the 1960s, when university salaries were much lower and research funding was harder to find. For Harvard researchers struggling to fund their work, it was an irresistible offer. The researchers accepted, and they began their work. The sugar industry had given them a simple task: evaluate the existing scientific research on diet and heart disease, then publish a review of what they found. On the surface, this seemed like legitimate scientific work. Universities publish literature reviews all the time. But what made this different was what happened behind the scenes. The sugar industry wasn't just funding passive research, they were actively controlling it. Internal documents would later reveal that the sugar executives weren't simply writing checks and walking away. They were in constant communication with the Harvard researchers. They were telling the scientists which studies to include in the review and which studies to ignore or downplay. They were suggesting exactly how the conclusions should be written and framed. They were pushing one simple narrative above all others: fat and cholesterol were the real villains in heart disease, not sugar. Think of it like a courtroom trial where evidence exists on both sides of the case, where reasonable scientists could look at the data and come to different conclusions, but one side is quietly paying the lawyers to argue their case. The lawyers aren't necessarily lying, but they're selective about which evidence they present, how they interpret the evidence, and which facts they emphasize. They're doing exactly what they've been paid to do. This is what happened with the sugar research. The scientists weren't inventing false data. They were being selective about which data they included and how they interpreted what the data meant. In 1967, after months of work guided by sugar industry executives, the finished paper was completed and submitted for publication. It was accepted by one of the most prestigious medical journals in the entire world, the New England Journal of Medicine. This journal was considered the gold standard of scientific publishing. If your research appeared in the New England Journal of Medicine, it had to be trustworthy. It had to be real science, conducted with integrity, and published according to the highest standards. The paper appeared in the journal with no indication of the financial conflict of interest. At that time, the New England Journal of Medicine did not require authors to disclose who had funded their research. So readers saw this review as independent science, conducted by honest Harvard researchers interested only in finding the truth. Doctors across America read this paper and trusted it. They recommended low-fat diets to their patients based on it. Policymakers read this paper and trusted it. Governments began drafting nutritional guidelines recommending that Americans eat less fat. The financial conflict behind the research stayed completely hidden. Nobody knew that the sugar industry had paid for it, not the public, not policymakers. Not even the doctors reading it and recommending its conclusions to their patients. This single paper would shape global food policy for decades. It would change what billions of people ate. It would reshape the entire food industry, and it all happened because of money. After the Harvard Review was published, something remarkable happened. The narrative about heart disease and diet shifted almost overnight. Fat became public enemy number one. Suddenly, everywhere in America, people were hearing that fat was dangerous and that they should avoid it at all costs. Governments issued official dietary guidelines recommending low-fat diets. Food companies, always quick to capitalize on new trends, rushed to adapt their products. They created entirely new product lines labeled low-fat and fat-free and marketed them as heart-healthy choices. Supermarkets filled their shelves with these new products. Breakfast cereals were reformulated to be low-fat. Yogurt manufacturers created low-fat versions. Snack bar companies jumped on the trend. Even pasta sauce manufacturers began removing fat from their products. But there was a fundamental problem with this strategy, and the food companies understood it. When you remove fat from food, the food doesn't taste good anymore. Fat carries flavor. Fat makes food enjoyable. When you take out the fat, you're left with something bland and unappetizing that nobody wants to eat. Food companies knew that nobody would buy their low-fat products if they tasted terrible. So they needed to add something else to make the food taste good. They needed something sweet. They needed sugar. And so sugar quietly flooded into the American food supply in massive quantities. Low-fat breakfast cereals had added sugar. Low-fat yogurt had added sugar. Low-fat snack bars had added sugar. Every low-fat product had more sugar than its full-fat original version. The irony was stunning and tragic. People were trying to eat healthy by choosing low-fat products, and in doing so, they were actually consuming far more sugar than they would have eaten otherwise. The financial consequences of this shift were enormous. The sugar industry, which had orchestrated this entire narrative change through their Harvard investment, got exactly what they wanted. Their market remained protected. In fact, it grew. Food companies, following the new low-fat trend, created entirely new product categories worth billions of dollars. They invested in factories, marketing campaigns, and distribution networks for all these new low-fat products. And sugar consumption skyrocketed across the entire nation. People were eating more sugar than ever before in human history, hidden inside products marketed as healthy alternatives. The sugar industry had accomplished something remarkable. They had shaped global health policy to ensure that sugar consumption would increase while their product would be blamed on fat instead. But here's where the story takes a dramatic turn. Decades later, as time passed and medical science advanced, researchers began asking a simple question that nobody had properly asked before. What if fat isn't actually the main problem? What if sugar, not fat, is really what causes heart disease and obesity and diabetes? Scientists began conducting new research, reading the old research more carefully, and examining historical data about diet and disease. They noticed something that should have been obvious all along. In societies where fat consumption was high but sugar consumption was low, heart disease was less common. In societies where sugar consumption was high, heart disease and obesity became epidemic problems. The evidence began pointing in a direction that contradicted everything the low-fat movement had taught. Scientists and historians began wondering about the origins of the low-fat movement. Why had the narrative shifted so dramatically in the 1960s? Why had governments and doctors so quickly embraced the idea that fat was the villain? What was the basis for this massive shift in health policy? And so they began digging into the archives, looking for the original documents and letters from that era. What they found was shocking and infuriating. In 2016, researchers from the University of California, San Francisco uncovered internal documents from the sugar industry that had been hidden away in archives for decades. The investigation was led by researcher Kristen Kearns and health policy expert Stanton Glantz. These weren't vague hints or circumstantial evidence. These were actual internal letters and memos from sugar industry executives discussing their plan to fund Harvard research and shape the scientific narrative. The documents confirmed definitively what had long been suspected but never proven. The sugar industry had secretly funded and heavily influenced the Harvard research that shaped decades of nutrition policy. They had paid Harvard researchers to steer blame away from sugar at a critical moment in history, when the direction of nutrition science was being decided. By the time the truth surfaced and these documents were revealed to the public, the damage was already catastrophic and global. Obesity rates had exploded across the entire developed world. What had once been a rare disease had become a normal condition. Type 2 diabetes, which is directly caused by excessive sugar consumption and obesity, had become a worldwide epidemic affecting hundreds of millions of people. Children were developing diabetes at alarming rates. Governments had spent hundreds of billions of dollars treating diseases linked to poor diet. Healthcare systems were being overwhelmed by obesity-related conditions. Heart disease, the very disease that the low-fat movement had been designed to prevent, was still killing millions of people every year, and now it was being made worse by excessive sugar consumption. The financial story of this scandal goes even deeper than just the immediate impact on sugar sales and food company profits. This wasn't simply about sugar versus fat. It was about something far more profound and troubling: corporate influence over science itself. The sugar industry had discovered a powerful principle that would be adopted by many other industries. You don't have to change the facts. You don't have to manufacture false data. You don't have to do anything dishonest with the actual science. If you can shape which research gets funded and which doesn't, if you can influence how questions are asked and which answers get highlighted and amplified, then you can shape how the world understands the truth. You can shape public policy. You can shape what people eat and how they live. You can do all of this while maintaining the appearance of scientific integrity. After the sugar scandal was exposed, other industries realized that this same strategy could work for them too. Tobacco companies began funding studies about smoking and health, carefully selecting researchers and studies that would question the link between smoking and cancer. Oil companies began funding research about climate change, looking for scientists who would express doubt about the consensus. Pharmaceutical companies began funding drug trials for their own medications, creating financial incentives for researchers to find positive results. The pattern repeated across industry after industry. The money doesn't always change the actual data, but it can very effectively influence which questions get asked, which research gets funded, which results get published, and which findings get amplified to the public. Today, most major scientific journals require funding disclosures. Researchers are supposed to reveal who paid for their work. Universities have conflict of interest policies. Ethics committees review research proposals before they're conducted. These reforms happen partly because of the sugar scandal and other similar scandals that exposed how money could corrupt science. But the sugar scandal left an important warning that still applies today. Science does not exist outside of economics. Research requires funding. Money is necessary to conduct studies, pay researchers, publish results, and communicate findings. And whoever provides that funding has tremendous power to influence how that research is conducted and what it concludes. In the 1960s, a few $1,000s of sugar industry money, roughly $50,000 in modern currency, helped protect an industry worth billions of dollars. The ripple effects of that single investment lasted half a century. Millions of people changed their eating habits. Billions of dollars were spent on low-fat products. Trillions in healthcare costs were generated by obesity and diabetes epidemics. And all of this was influenced by a single funded paper from Harvard University that most people have never heard of. The real question that emerges from this scandal isn't just about sugar, although sugar is certainly part of the story. The real question is about incentives and power. Because when billions of dollars are on the line, when an entire industry's survival depends on how science interprets the evidence, how often does money shape the science that we trust? How many other research papers were influenced by funding we don't know about? How many other industries are currently funding research that shapes public policy? How many scientific questions are never asked because funding wouldn't be available to answer them? How many inconvenient truths are buried because the industries that would be hurt by those truths have the power to influence which research gets conducted and which research gets published? The sugar scandal teaches us that the appearance of scientific integrity isn't enough. We need actual transparency. We need to know who funded research. We need to understand the financial incentives behind the scientists we trust. We need to think critically about who benefits when certain conclusions are published. And we need to remember that science is conducted by humans, and humans respond to incentives. When billions of dollars are on the line, the incentives are powerful. The sugar scandal shows what can happen when those incentives are allowed to shape our understanding of truth. The 1967 sugar scandal is ultimately a story about how money can quietly influence science and how the decisions made in closed rooms by executives and scientists can reshape global health for decades. One funded paper helped protect $1 billion industry and changed how the world eats. The consequences were measured in obesity rates, in diabetes epidemics, in healthcare costs, and in human suffering, and most people have never heard about it. This is why understanding the financial history of scientific research matters. Because the biggest economic secrets, the ones that affect billions of lives and cost billions of dollars, are often hiding in plain sight, hidden in scientific papers and funding disclosures that nobody reads, protected by the assumption that science is always honest and always free from financial influence.